You're standing in Camulodunum, Roman Colchester, on a spring morning in 60 CE when you notice the temple doors have been barred from the inside. The veterans who built their retirement villas on confiscated tribal land are gathering weapons they haven't touched in decades. Someone's children are crying in the forum, confused by the panic in their parents' voices. Then you hear it, the sound that will haunt Roman nightmares for generations. Thousands of voices rising in a war cry that shakes the timber frames of Roman buildings. Boudica is coming. And in the next 72 hours, her forces will commit an act of retribution so complete, so methodologically brutal, that it will nearly erase Rome's presence from Britain forever. What you've been told about this rebellion, the romantic story of a wronged queen rising against oppression, that's not the whole truth. What I'm about to show you is the archaeological evidence of systematic massacre, the military miscalculations that enabled it, and the specific atrocities that made Boudica's revenge one of the most devastating defeats Rome ever suffered. This isn't a story about heroic resistance. This is about what happens when colonial violence meets indigenous rage, and neither side recognizes any limits. Before we examine the slaughter, you need to understand the machinery that made it inevitable. Most people imagine Roman Britain as a functioning province where local tribes accepted imperial authority. The reality preserved in administrative correspondence and tribal burial sites reveals something far more volatile. What decades of archaeological excavation have uncovered is a deliberate system of economic extraction and cultural humiliation, designed to break British tribal identity while enriching Roman administrators and their client kings. The first thing you need to understand is how Rome weaponized death. Nobody aspires to see their children enslaved. Yet when Prasutagus, Boudica's husband and client king of the Iceni, died in 60 CE, Roman procurators arrived with ledgers showing massive outstanding loans. These weren't legitimate debts. They were retroactive revaluations of gifts that had been presented as tributes to allied kings. Seneca the philosopher, yes, that's Seneca, the one who wrote beautifully about Stoic virtue, had personally loaned the British tribes 40 million sesterces. When he suddenly recalled these loans simultaneously, demanding immediate repayment with interest, he knew exactly what he was doing. Families who couldn't pay saw their children seized as debt slaves. Nobles who had accepted Roman alliance found themselves stripped of property that had belonged to their clans for generations. The mathematics of humiliation were precisely calculated to transfer British wealth into Roman hands while providing legal cover for what was really happening. Theft disguised as finance. The daily reality of Roman occupation was far from the civilizing mission described in official histories. When Prasutagus died, he'd attempted to protect his family by naming the Emperor Nero co-heir alongside his daughters, hoping this would guarantee Roman protection. Instead, it triggered something worse. Procurator Catus Decianus saw the king's death as an opportunity for enrichment. His agents didn't just seize the royal treasury. They went house to house through Iceni settlements, confiscating property, beating tribal elders who protested, treating a supposed allied kingdom like conquered territory. Then came the atrocity that ignited the rebellion. According to Tacitus, who compiled his account from military records and survivor testimonies, Boudica herself was publicly flogged. Her daughters were raped by Roman soldiers. Not in chaotic violence, but as deliberate punishment, carried out systematically to demonstrate what Roman power meant when you ceased to be useful. Understand what this accomplished psychologically. Boudica wasn't a commoner. She was queen of a major tribal confederation. Her public humiliation signaled to every British tribe that Roman alliance meant nothing, that your status provided no protection, that women and children were legitimate targets when Rome decided to assert dominance. The Iceni and their neighbors, the Trinovantes, whose lands had been systematically confiscated to build the Roman colony at Camulodunum, didn't need further convincing. The tribal councils met, warriors gathered, and Boudica, transformed from queen to war leader, began planning something Rome had never anticipated: the complete eradication of Roman presence in Britain. Here's what archaeological evidence reveals about the rebellion's first target. Camulodunum in 60 CE was essentially a Roman retirement community for veterans, built deliberately on the most sacred Trinovantian tribal lands. These veterans had been given confiscated estates as rewards for military service. They'd built their comfortable villas directly over demolished British settlements. The Temple of Claudius dominated the town center, a massive structure requiring forced British labor to construct, dedicated to worshipping a dead emperor, financed through taxes extracted from the very tribes whose land had been stolen. The veterans hadn't maintained military readiness. Why would they? Britain was pacified. The legions were campaigning in Wales, crushing the Druids on Anglesey. The colony had minimal defensive walls and almost no garrison. When panicked messages reached them warning that 80,000 British warriors were approaching, the veterans sent desperate requests for reinforcement to the procurator in Londinium. Catus Decianus, the same administrator whose greed had triggered the crisis, sent exactly 200 poorly equipped auxiliary soldiers. Then he fled to Gaul. This is the part traditional histories minimize because what happened next doesn't fit comfortable narratives about honorable warfare. Boudica's forces reached Camulodunum and found the veterans barricaded inside the temple of Claudius. The siege lasted 2 days. When the British finally broke through, they didn't take prisoners. They didn't offer surrender terms. Archaeological excavations of Colchester's destruction layer, a band of burned debris containing thousands of artifacts all dated to this precise moment, reveal what happened. The town was systematically annihilated. Every building was burned. Every inhabitant was killed. Men, women, children, slaves, no one was spared. The destruction was so complete that when you excavate through Colchester's strata, you find this unmistakable burn layer marking where Roman occupation simply stopped existing. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The British didn't just kill, they ritualized the slaughter. Human remains found in the Colchester destruction layer show evidence of specific mutilation patterns. Decapitation, dismemberment. Bodies deliberately displayed in ways that matched Celtic religious practice regarding enemy dead. This wasn't frenzied violence. This was systematic sacrifice, possibly to British war gods, transforming Roman colonists into offerings that would spiritually cleanse the land. Tacitus records that the British could not wait to cut throats, hang, burn, and crucify. He mentions this almost casually, but understand what he's describing. Execution methods that mirrored exactly how Rome treated rebels, now being inflicted on Roman citizens by the people they'd colonized. The 9th Legion, marching from the north to relieve Camulodunum, walked directly into the British Army's path. Petilius Cerealis commanded approximately 2,000 legionaries and support troops, a formidable force under normal circumstances. Against Boudica's 80,000 warriors, already victory-drunk from annihilating Camulodunum, they didn't stand a chance. The British overwhelmed the column in open battle. The infantry was completely destroyed. Cerealis escaped with only his cavalry, fleeing back to his fortress and abandoning central Britain to the rebellion. This wasn't a skirmish. This was the near-complete destruction of a Roman legion, an event so catastrophic that it happened only a handful of times in Rome's entire history. Now Boudica turned toward Londinium, Roman London. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, returning in forced marches from his campaign in Wales, reached the town just ahead of the British army. He had perhaps 10,000 troops. Boudica had at least 80,000, possibly more, as additional tribes joined the rebellion after witnessing Rome's apparent collapse. Suetonius made a decision that Roman military doctrine demanded, but which doomed Londinium's population. He evacuated with his army, abandoning the city to save his forces for a decisive battle on ground of his choosing. Tacitus records that civilians begged to be taken with the retreating soldiers. Most were refused. The town had perhaps 15 to 20,000 inhabitants. They were left behind to face what was coming. The archaeological evidence from London's destruction layer tells the story more vividly than any text. The British Army reached Londinium and burned it so thoroughly that the heat signatures are still detectable in soil samples 2,000 years later. We're not talking about ordinary fire. We're talking about sustained burning hot enough to melt pottery, fuse metal objects, and reduce timber-framed buildings to their foundations. But before the burning came the killing. Excavations in the Walbrook Valley have uncovered mass deposits of human skulls, decapitated heads thrown into the sacred stream, possibly as offerings to British water deities. Recent analysis of these skulls reveals something horrifying. They show evidence of display before deposition, meaning they were likely mounted on stakes or poles after decapitation, exhibited as trophies, then ritually deposited. The victims include men, women, and children. Londinium's entire population was essentially exterminated, with survivors, if any, taken as slaves or sacrificed later. Tacitus provides a number that still shocks historians. 70,000 Roman citizens and allies killed in the destruction of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, the 3 major Roman settlements in Britain. Recent archaeological surveys suggest this number isn't exaggeration. It's probably conservative. These weren't military casualties. These were deliberate massacres of civilian populations trapped in settlements they couldn't defend. Boudica's forces didn't attack military installations. They targeted the infrastructure of Roman civilian life. The towns, the villas, the economic networks that made occupation profitable. They were systematically erasing Rome's presence, making Britain too costly to hold. Here's the evidence that reveals Rome's long-term strategy. After crushing the rebellion, Roman policy toward Britain changed fundamentally. The client kingdom system was abandoned, too risky when client kings could become rebellion leaders. Direct military occupation intensified. 3 permanent legionary fortresses were established. Road networks expanded to enable rapid military response. But most significantly, the cultural Romanization program accelerated. Towns were rebuilt larger and more Roman. British aristocrats were actively recruited into Roman administration. The sons of tribal leaders were sent to Rome for education, becoming hostages in everything but name. Rome learned that controlling Britain required not just military dominance, but cultural transformation, so complete that British identity itself would be subsumed into Roman identity. The archaeological record shows this worked eventually. By the 2nd century CE, British elites were building Roman-style villas, adopting Roman names, worshipping Roman gods. The language was changing. The culture was changing. Within 3 generations, the kind of unified British resistance Boudica had mustered became impossible because Britishness as a unifying identity had been deliberately fragmented. This was colonialism at its most sophisticated. Not just conquering bodies and land, but conquering memory and identity. Yet Boudica's rebellion cast a permanent shadow over Roman Britain. The province never became fully profitable. It required permanent military garrison far larger than comparable regions. British auxiliary units were never fully trusted and were typically deployed outside Britain to prevent another unified uprising. And in Rome's collective memory, Britannia remained the place where 80,000 citizens had been slaughtered by a barbarian queen, where Roman supremacy had been challenged so effectively that it took genocide to restore control. The definitive truth is that both sides committed atrocities that should disturb us. Boudica's forces massacred tens of thousands of civilians, many of whom were just trying to survive under occupation, using methods deliberately designed to maximize suffering. Roman forces responded with systematic extermination campaigns that killed entire tribal populations. Neither side recognized limits, neither side acknowledged innocence. The only morality that mattered was us versus them, and anything done to them was justified by what they had done to us. This changes everything about how we should understand colonial violence and resistance. The comfortable narrative treats Boudica as a freedom fighter and Rome as an oppressive empire. That's partially true. But it's also true that freedom fighting included burning families alive in Verulamium and ritually decapitating children in Londinium. It's true that Roman civilization included flogging queens and raping their daughters as official policy. When you examine the evidence without nationalist mythology or moral simplification, what you see is civilizational conflict where both sides weaponized cruelty, where systemic injustice provoked systematic massacre, and where the only winners were those who survived to write the histories that justified their side's violence. If this investigation into Britain's most catastrophic rebellion has challenged what you thought you knew about ancient history, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting, because we're systematically exposing how complex and disturbing historical truth becomes when you follow the evidence rather than comfortable narratives. The machinery of colonial violence and indigenous resistance was never about heroes and villains. It was about power, revenge, and the terrible things both sides convinced themselves were necessary. What other historical narratives need this kind of unflinching examination? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.